Have you ever noticed God's irony? I think God uses irony to keep us focused on Him and His sovereignty and what He is doing rather than assuming things are going to turn out logically according to our own understanding. There's a good example that I remember from about 30 years ago. I attended a church, a fairly large church, and towards the end of the service, some of the leaders were praying for a lady who had cancer. She was up at the altar and they were laying hands on her and they were praying for her. All of a sudden, we hear a loud gasp for air. It wasn't coming from down in front, it was coming from over to the side. I was in the choir loft and I could see a commotion starting over where that sound came from. And then we heard the same sound again. It turns out that there was a gentleman over there who went into cardiac arrest. Now, what actually happened is quite amazing. There was an EMT sitting in front of him who jumped over the pew to render assistance, and a nurse who was sitting nearby came rushing over too. And she said to the EMT, if you'll do compressions, I'll do breaths. And they were getting ready to start CPR, and the EMT, who I get the impression his faith really wasn't really strong, but he remembered to pray. And he says, Lord, if you can ever use me, let it be now. Just after he prayed that, the gentleman sat up and says, I feel better now. Of course, the EMT and the nurse and the people around him said, wait a minute, okay, great, but lay down. We're going to wait for the ambulance to get here. And this being towards the end of the service, it was actually after the service by the time the ambulance arrived, and they came in and took him out on a stretcher. Later on, we find out that when he got to the hospital and they checked him over and did all the tests, they could not find anything wrong with him. There was absolutely no indication of why he went into cardiac arrest. There was no damage. There was no anything that indicated it even happened. In fact, that gentleman came back eventually and shared with the church, what had happened, and shared his story, as did the EMT. That's how I know the story. But anyway, the irony is, this guy should have been dead, or at least he should have had a very serious heart situation that perhaps could have been revived from. But he was in bad shape there initially, and meanwhile, he wasn't even the guy that was being prayed for, but he suddenly gets healed. The lady who they were praying for eventually died from her cancer not too long after that. So, yeah, God likes to use irony. He doesn't want us assuming that we know it all. He likes us to know that He is in charge and that He can do something out of the ordinary and unlikely and illogical and whatever we want to call it, while allowing something else that perhaps He might normally have intervened in to go ahead and take place. Now we know that God has a plan for each of us, and that it was not part of His plan, obviously, for that lady to survive her cancer and to continue on living for a number more years. And likewise, it wasn't His plan for this gentleman who had the heart attack to pass away at that time. So, in fact, if he had, I wouldn't be telling you this story right now. So, God, I guess you could say, is an ironic God. What seems like it should happen doesn't always happen. And what seems like it shouldn't have happened, happens. And it's because He is the one who is in charge. He is the one who knows what His purposes are. And He wants us to know that we are dependent upon Him. And things will happen according to what He knows is the perfect outcome for every situation.